The machines hummed indifferent to the war inside my body. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. But I heard everything. My son's voice, calm, calculated, filled the room like a toxin. "She wouldn't want to be kept alive like this," he said, not even pretending to hesitate. I wanted to turn my head to make my eyes beg, plead rage. But my body betrayed me in silence. I was locked beneath the surface, listening as my daughter-in-law signed a document with a casual flick of her pen. "DNR confirmed," the nurse murmured. They both nodded like they were checking off a to-do list. What I remember most was the sound of a leather portfolio closing over the papers that would end my life. No ceremony, no tearful goodbyes, just the zipper, the shuffle of shoes, the artificial cheer in my daughter-in-law's voice as she asked where to find decent movers in town. Movers. I already called the agent, my son said. "She said if we stage the place right, we'll get full asking." My house. He was talking about my house. The one I'd paid off in full by the time he turned 20, the one with the swing still in the backyard rusted but standing, the one where his height was still measured in pen marks along the pantry wall. My chest burned with something deeper than pain. I was still there inside, whole, remembering everything. My body may have collapsed, but my mind hadn't. My memories hadn't. My grief hadn't. A tear rolled slowly from the corner of my eye, barely noticed by the nurse who adjusted my IV. She smiled softly at me. Still nothing, she whispered to herself. I wanted to scream, "I'm here. I'm here." But all I could do was listen. I heard them talk about clearing the furniture, about keeping a few things for their own house. I heard my daughter-in-law complain about the smell of the place, as if years of living and love and cooking and sickness were somehow offensive to her real estate ambitions. My son, my only child, said nothing in my defense. He just sighed and told her, "We'll have to be quick. If she passes this week, we could close before the end of the month." If she passes, as if I were already gone. That night, I lay in the dark, unable to turn toward the window. The room felt smaller, somehow tighter. The light from the hallway pooled under the door like a diluted warning. My fingers wouldn't move. My lips were stone. But in my mind, I was running through my house, touching everything they would erase. The quilt I made in '97, the letter I kept from his father tucked in the back of my cookbook, the stained glass ornament he made in 2nd grade that still hung in the kitchen window, even though it hadn't caught sunlight in years. They would throw it all away, and I couldn't stop them. I couldn't even blink. He was born in a snowstorm. I remember that first cry like it echoed inside my bones, a sharp, trembling sound that made everything else in the world irrelevant. I was 22, newly widowed, and suddenly in charge of a life that needed me in ways I hadn't yet learned to need myself. The nurse placed him in my arms, swaddled tight, his face wrinkled and furious with new life. I whispered, "It's you and me, now." And it was. For nearly 4 decades. I never remarried. Never even dated, really. I poured myself into motherhood the way people pour into faith. There were years I worked doubles at the hospital mornings, in admissions nights scrubbing surgical tools just to keep the lights on and the mortgage paid. I skipped dinners, skipped sleep, skipped my own birthday once. But I never skipped a single parent-teacher conference. Not one. I remember making up games to distract him when the power got cut off. We called it campfire night. I'd light candles and make peanut butter crackers pretending it was a grand adventure. He never knew we were broke until he was older. I was proud of that. I thought that meant I'd done something right. There were nights I cried into my pillow quietly so he wouldn't hear. Nights I let dinner burn because I was too tired to stand. I developed arthritis in my late 30s, but I never let it keep me from packing his lunch, ironing his uniform, or driving him to basketball practice in the freezing rain. I used to sit in the car for hours while he ran drills. I brought him hot chocolate in a thermos with his name etched on the side. I still remember how he smiled when he saw it, like I'd done something magical. When he got into college, I took out a second mortgage. I told him there was a scholarship. There wasn't. I just didn't want him to feel guilt where pride should be. I worked weekend shifts at a diner and evenings back at the hospital. I lived on caffeine and ibuprofen, falling asleep with receipts tucked between pages of overdue bills. But I'd watch him come home during breaks, taller, wiser, full of opinions, and I thought, this is worth it. He's going to be someone I can lean on when I'm old. That was the story I told myself, the balm I used to numb the exhaustion. When he graduated, I wore a second-hand dress and a pin with his baby picture on it. I cheered louder than anyone. He looked for me in the crowd. That smile, I hadn't seen it in years. He moved home briefly before landing a job in another state. I helped him pack, folded his socks, ironed his shirts. He hugged me tight before he drove away, said he'd call when he got there. He did. For a while. Then came the gaps, the excuses. He was busy. She was busy. They had a lot going on. I told myself it was normal. He was building a life. The first time he forgot my birthday, I let it slide. The second time, he sent flowers' wrong name on the card. I kept the card anyway. After he married, things changed faster. His wife was distant, polite, cold in the way expensive marble counters are cold, always perfect, always calculating. She called me Maureen instead of Mom, told me what vitamins I should be taking, what furniture was outdated. She reorganized my spice rack and said nothing when I cried about it. I pretended not to notice. He stopped coming home for holidays. They invited me to theirs once. The guest room had no pictures, no blankets. I felt like I was renting space in their life. Still, I tried. I sent cards, left voicemails, made casseroles and froze them in disposable tins. They stayed in the freezer until the next visit untouched. I told myself they were just busy. That's what you do when you've given your entire self to someone. You lie to yourself. You make excuses. You remember the thermos and forget the silence. One night I sat alone on the porch, the wind curling around my ankles like an old regret. I looked out at the garden, my hands folded in my lap, and wondered when exactly I had stopped mattering. Was it the moment he left for college? Was it when I co-signed on their condo loan and they never paid me back? Or was it just gradual erosion? A slow wearing away of attention, of love, of responsibility. I didn't want to believe he was capable of cruelty, but neglect, I learned, is its own kind of violence. Quiet, legal, sanctioned by society. I spent my last birthday before the stroke alone. He'd promised to come. They canceled that morning. Car trouble, he texted. No call, no apology, just silence. I made myself a cake. Chocolate. From a box. I sat at the table and sang to myself softly like a lullaby. I blew out the candles and made a wish. It didn't come true. The house creaked differently after he stopped visiting. Every room had an echo to it, like it was trying to remember what it used to hold. I kept the place clean, polished, warm. I still made too much food, as if he might knock on the door at any moment, grinning like he used to, asking if there was leftover meatloaf or if I'd made those molasses cookies he liked as a kid. But the cookies sat untouched in the tin. I started freezing half my meals, not out of convenience, out of habit, out of hope. His calls became rehearsed clinical. I could hear her voice in the background telling him what to say. Ask how she's feeling. Remind her to take her blood pressure meds. Don't commit to anything. He would laugh, but it was the kind of laugh that didn't touch his eyes anymore. I noticed that first, that his voice didn't sound like it remembered me, that it was flatter, more like a voice he put on for telemarketers or bank clerks, not his mother. I remember one call in particular. I had just finished folding laundry. My back ached from being bent too long over the basket. I had something to tell him. I can't even remember what now, but I picked up the phone and waited for the warmth I used to feel when I heard his voice. Instead, he launched into updates about the house they were renovating. His voice was full of color then, full of light. He talked about countertops and recessed lighting and how much the pool install would cost. I said, "That sounds lovely," and he replied, "I'll send photos if I remember." He didn't. That was the first time I felt the real shift in him, not anger, not even resentment, just distance. Like I was a small dot in his rearview mirror and he'd stopped checking to see if I was still there. Later that month they visited. I had baked cinnamon rolls, his favorite. I wore the sweater he'd given me 4 Christmases ago. I even set out the nicer plates, the ones with the painted blue edges that only came out when company did. He arrived holding his phone in one hand and a reusable coffee cup in the other. She followed behind wearing sunglasses, even though it was cloudy. They stayed for 22 minutes. They declined the cinnamon rolls, said they were gluten-free now. He looked around like a real estate agent taking inventory, not a son coming home. I watched his gaze pause on the water stain near the baseboard, the crack in the plaster by the kitchen window. He didn't look at the photos on the mantel, didn't ask how I'd been sleeping, didn't notice my limp had gotten worse. Before they left, she pulled me aside gently. Her voice was sweet and sticky like sap. "Have you thought about downsizing, Maureen? This house is getting hard to keep up with, don't you think?" I smiled. Not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know what else to do. I was raised to be polite, even to cruelty dressed in kindness. After they left, I sat down on the couch with a cold cup of tea and stared at the indentation his body used to make in the cushion beside me. I reached for the remote and turned on the TV, not to watch, but for the sound. That night, I found the box in the attic where I'd stored all his old report cards, drawings, birthday cards he'd made with construction paper and too much glue. I ran my hand over the faded crayon lines, the crooked handwriting that once said, "To the bestest mom." I pressed it to my chest. I whispered, "Where did you go?" I never got an answer. The stroke came quietly. I was in the kitchen trying to open a jar of olives. I remember the lid slipping, the jar tipping, the sound of glass hitting the floor. Then nothing. No warning, no pain. Just the surreal sensation of watching your own body give out and knowing you can't stop it. When I woke in ICU, I wasn't even sure I had woken. Everything was muffled. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't breathe on my own, but I could hear. I could hear. At first, I thought that was a blessing, a sign that I wasn't truly lost. But it became its own kind of torture. Hearing doctors speak over me like I wasn't there. Hearing the cold, familiar tone of my son when he said, "If there's no progress in a week, we need to think about long-term care." Hearing my daughter-in-law say, "We can't afford to wait around forever. You know how slow the probate process is if we don't have things in order." That word probate. It wasn't just concern for my health. It was logistics. It was estate planning. It was convenience. I realized with a thud that hit deeper than any stroke ever could that I had become an obstacle. A piece of property still under contract. A name on a deed that needed to be scrubbed clean. That night, a nurse left the blinds open a crack. I could see the window, the way the light fractured against the glass. I stared at it silently, begging it to shatter, to do what I could not, to scream for me. The next morning, I heard them signing papers. My house. Gone. And I was still here. It was some time past midnight when I first realized they thought I was already gone. Not dead yet, but gone in the way people say about someone who isn't really there anymore. A hollow body, a fading ghost. I'd heard the nurse earlier that evening whisper to her colleague in the hall. It's so sad. Poor thing hasn't moved once. They say there's no brain activity. No brain activity. I wanted to laugh, or scream, or weep. Anything to acknowledge the insult of those words. But I was frozen somewhere between the world of the living and the edge of complete erasure. Inside my skull, I was bursting with memory rage, grief. But to them, I was a shadow under white sheets, a case number on a clipboard. I knew my son would come in the next morning. He never came at night. She did. She always came alone. That night I heard her heels click softly against the floor tiles, her perfume hitting my senses like a blade of cold glass, sharp, sterile, too sweet. She stood at the side of my bed for a long time longer than usual. She didn't speak at first. Just adjusted my blanket, tucked a strand of hair behind my ear like she was doing something tender. It felt like a lie. Then she leaned down her breath inches from my face and said almost lovingly, "You held on longer than I thought you would. I wanted to blink, to scream." But she wasn't done. "We need this to be over, Maureen. It's not fair to Jason. He can't move forward if you keep holding on. You're keeping him stuck. Keeping him stuck." She said it like I was a broken down couch. Someone was too sentimental to throw away. Not a person, not a mother, not the woman who had once held him to my chest, desperate to protect him from everything in this cruel world, including women like her. Then she did something I will never forget. She pulled out her phone, dialed a number, and left it on speaker. "I've spoken with the hospice coordinator," she said to the person on the line. "They'll help transition her out. Yes, we've signed the DNR. No resistance from the family. Her son is on board." On board? It sounded like they were discussing removing an outdated feature from a software program. I was drowning under her words, and she didn't even see it. When she hung up, she looked at me again. Not kindly, not cruelly, just efficiently. "It's better this way. You wouldn't want to be a burden." That word. Burden. That's how they saw me now. Not as a life, not as a woman, not even as a mother. Just wait. Just property. Just delay. She left the room without another glance. The lights dimmed automatically. The only sound was the rhythmic breath of the ventilator. It was a sound I had grown to hate because it reminded me I was still here, still hearing, still helpless. And yet, beneath the helplessness, something else began to bloom. I couldn't name it at first. It wasn't hope. Not yet. It wasn't rage either, though I carried plenty. It was a kind of remembering, a reassembling of the parts of myself I'd been too tired to claim for years. I remembered holding my son's fevered body all night when he was 10. I remembered sitting in the principal's office to defend him when he was unfairly blamed for a fight he didn't start. I remembered sacrificing my own life so that he could have one. And this was how it ended. Sold, signed away, declared unnecessary. No. That night I didn't sleep. Not because I couldn't, but because I wouldn't. I spent every silent hour combing through every detail of who I had been, every moment I'd given up, every time I'd chosen love over self-preservation. And something inside me decided, if there's even the slightest chance to fight, I will take it. The next morning I heard a new voice, a young nurse, brighter. Her steps were lighter, her voice not yet hardened by the grief that saturated rooms like mine. She was humming some old Motown song I used to dance to while vacuuming the living room. She came to my side, checked my IV, then gently touched my hand. "Hey there," she said softly. "I'm Megan. You've got me today." She sat beside me reading my chart, and I focused with everything I had on my eyelids. I didn't know how. I didn't know if it was even possible, but I pulled every ounce of my soul into a single command blink. Nothing happened. She stood to adjust the monitor. My breath caught not in my lungs, but in my mind. 1,000 images surged through me. My son's first step, his college graduation, her hand signing the DNR. And then I tried again. Blink. A flicker. Just a whisper of motion. Megan froze. She looked down at me, eyes wide. "Did you wait?" "Do that again." I summoned it again, focusing every ounce of my being on that one small motion. My eyelid twitched. Tears welled in her eyes. "Oh my God, you're in there!" She ran for the neurologist. The next few hours moved fast. Flashlights, tests, a whiteboard placed in my field of vision. They gave me a yes-no system. I used one blink for yes, two for no. They asked, "Do you know your name?" One blink. "Do you know where you are?" One blink. Then they asked the hardest question, "Do you want to live?" One blink. She smiled, and I did it again. One blink. I was back. Not all the way. Not yet. But enough. Enough to make sure they saw me. Enough to make sure they would never again assume I was already gone. They called my son 2 days later. I was propped up slightly now, able to track movement with my eyes and answer simple questions with blinks. Speech was still distant, maybe impossible, but I was inarguably present, conscious, aware. He didn't come right away. I don't know if he was busy or afraid or just inconvenienced. But on the 3rd day, he walked in. Alone. No flowers. No wife. He wore that same blue pullover he always wore when he didn't want to be noticed. He paused in the doorway like he expected someone else to explain this moment to him. The nurse looked up from adjusting my oxygen and smiled. "She's responding well. Strong eye tracking. We've started yes, no boards." He nodded slowly. "So she's really in there?" The nurse hesitated. She never left. He didn't say anything, just walked to the side of my bed and stood there, hands in his pockets, his mouth doing that twitchy thing it always did when he felt guilty. I watched his face carefully like I was memorizing it for the first time. I noticed things I hadn't seen before, how old he looked, how tired, how small. He didn't meet my eyes. Not really. Just looked around the room at the machines, the wires, the tube down my throat. Then finally at me. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "They told me you were gone." They. Always they. Never he. He sat down, exhaled like he'd run a mile, then whispered I didn't want this. My eyes burned. I didn't blink. Not yet. We didn't know what to do. I thought you wouldn't want to live like this. A beat passed. Do you want to live? One blink. He stared, then dropped his head into his hands. Jesus. He sat like that for a long time, silent. I counted the seconds between his breaths. When he looked up again, his eyes were red. They said the house was too much for you, that you'd want us to take care of it, that we could, use the money for care. No. He blinked away from me. Okay, not for care, for us. That's what she said. It made sense at the time. 2 blinks. His jaw tightened. I shouldn't have let her talk me into it. He shook his head like he could rattle the guilt out of his skull. I thought you'd already left. I watched him. Blinked once slowly, then again. Yes, I was saying. Yes, you thought I was already gone. I blinked once more, but I wasn't. He sat back as if the weight of that truth had finally settled on his chest. For a while, we just sat there, him breathing, me blinking. Finally, I lifted my eyes to the whiteboard beside my bed. The nurse had written the alphabet in rows along with yes and no squares. I looked at the alphabet line letter by letter until the nurse, watching from the door, noticed. She brought the pointer and waited for my eyes to rest. A, she asked. No blink. B. No. C. 1 blink. Letter by letter, word by word, it took me 20 minutes to spell. I was never gone. You just stopped looking. He read it slowly. His lips parted. His eyes glassed over again. He nodded. I know, he said. I know. I'm sorry. I wanted to ask him, where were you when the light bulbs needed changing? When my ankles swelled so badly I had to crawl to the kitchen when my birthday passed with nothing but a robocall from the pharmacy. I wanted to tell him that love without presence is just performance. That he had let her erase me in real time and he hadn't even resisted. But I couldn't speak. So I just looked at him, held his eyes as long as he would hold mine. And for the first time in what felt like years, he didn't look away. He didn't ask what I wanted him to do. He didn't beg for forgiveness. He just sat with me, quietly, completely. When the nurse came in to adjust the monitors, he stood. I'll come back tomorrow, he said. I blinked once. He paused at the door. Do you want to see the house? 2 blinks. I watched him flinch. I figured, he said. I'll handle that. I don't know what he meant by handle. Maybe sell it again. Maybe move back in. Maybe nothing. It didn't matter. Not anymore. That chapter was done. Burned quietly while I was trapped in my own body. What mattered was the next breath. The next nurse. The next round of therapy. What mattered was the space I still occupied in this world. The space I would reclaim inch by inch. Not for him. Not for forgiveness. For me. The first time they removed the breathing tube, even just briefly, the silence felt violent. I'd grown so used to the whir of machines, the forced rhythm of artificial breath, that the absence of it made the air feel too thin. I gasped, a rattling sound deep in my throat, my lungs fluttering like old curtains in a gust of wind. But I was breathing. on my own. The nurse's hand gripped mine. "You're doing it," she whispered, smiling like I'd just run a marathon. I blinked twice quickly. I wanted to say thank you. I wanted to say everything, but my tongue felt like a foreign object in my mouth. Muscles long forgotten had to relearn the shape of sound of self. It would take another 2 weeks before I could make a noise beyond a rasp, another month before I could form a full word. But every day I worked for it. In the rehab unit, they gave me alphabet boards, then flashcards, then a speech therapist with warm eyes and a voice that didn't flinch when I cried. She would sit with me for an hour, coaxing out vowel sounds like they were buried gold. She would say, "Can you try that?" And I would. Sometimes it came out as a grunt, sometimes as a sob. But one day it came out clean. I smiled so hard my jaw ached. She teared up. We're getting there. My son visited sporadically. He always came alone now. The silence between us had taken on a different tone, not avoidance, but recognition. As if we both understood that whatever came next wasn't going to fix what had happened. But it didn't need to. The healing wasn't for him. He brought things from the house photos, books, a small quilt I'd stitched from my mother's dresses. "I thought you'd want these," he said one day, setting them down carefully on the chair beside my bed. I looked through them slowly. The photograph of him at age 7, missing 2 front teeth arms, flung around a scruffy dog we'd fostered for 2 weeks. The pressed daisy I'd kept between pages of a mystery novel since the summer his father died. The note he'd written me in crayon after breaking a window with a soccer ball. "I'm sorry, Mom. I still love you." These were the fragments of a life I'd spent building piece by piece. And for a long time I thought they were all that remained. But there was something else too rising in me quietly, space to breathe, space to exist without waiting for someone to notice I was still here. I no longer looked to the door with hope. I no longer mistook visits for love. What mattered now was the breath in my chest, the voice in my throat, and the whisper of will that had refused to die when everything else had been stripped away. One afternoon, Megan, the nurse who'd first seen me blink, wheeled me outside. The sun hit my face like a song I hadn't heard in years. "You good?" she asked, tucking a blanket around my legs. I nodded slowly. The garden was quiet. A breeze moved through the trees like a sigh. I stared at the sky, not in longing, not in grief, just presence. She sat beside me in silence. Then, after a long while, she asked, "Did you ever get to tell him how you felt?" I turned to her. My voice was small, but it worked. "I did," I said. "Did it change anything?" I smiled faintly. "It changed me." She nodded. Sometimes that's the only thing that matters. Later that week, they offered to discharge me to a long-term care home, a clean, polished place with soft sheets and better views. I declined. Instead, I asked it to be taken to a small apartment they'd found for me nearby. Single story. Quiet street. Nothing extravagant. Just mine. They hesitated at first. Said it would be hard. Said I'd need help. I told them I had been helping others my whole life. I could learn to help myself. The first night in the apartment, I sat at the small kitchen table and made tea. Real tea, not hospital tea. I used the kettle I'd had since my 20s. I let the steam rise around my face and breathed it in like incense. There were no voices in the next room. No laughter, no arguments, no performance. Just me, alive. And enough. I didn't speak to Jason for several weeks after moving into the apartment. There was no dramatic break, no screaming match, no final declaration of estrangement. Just silence. I think we both needed it. He called once, left a voicemail, just wanted to check in. Let me know if you need anything. But I didn't need anything. That was the part he never understood, that love isn't measured by what you can deliver on demand. It's measured by presence, by attention, by the way someone says your name like it still matters, and mine hadn't mattered to him in a long time. The days in the apartment passed gently. I moved slowly like a woman getting used to her own skin again. I bought groceries in small amounts, cooked tiny meals, sat at the window during golden hour watching the light stretch across the floorboards like forgiveness. I began physical therapy again, this time not for survival, but for strength. I wanted to walk without fear, without leaning on someone, without apologizing for the space I took up. There was a neighbor upstairs, Lorna, 62, retired teacher. She brought me fresh bread one afternoon after she heard I'd moved in. No questions, no pity, just bread and a soft, "It's nice to have another woman on this floor." I didn't tell her anything. Not about the stroke, not about the DNR, not about the house. Some parts of your life get stripped away so violently you learn to protect what remains like sacred bone. But I liked her. I liked her quiet way of being. We shared tea sometimes, talked about books. She loaned me a wool shawl when the weather dipped. I returned it washed and folded with a single daffodil tucked in the corner. That was the nature of our friendship, unspoken, respectful, clean. One morning in April, a letter came. No return address. His handwriting. I sat with it for an hour before opening it. Inside was a single page. "Mom, I know I can never undo what I did, or didn't do. I know I stopped seeing you as a person the moment life became complicated. I think part of me believed it was mercy to let go, but it wasn't mercy. It was cowardice. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed to say this out loud. I was wrong. I loved you. I still do. I just didn't know how to carry it, and I let someone else carry it for me. That was my first mistake. I hope you're okay. I hope you're living in a place that feels like peace. I know you probably won't write back. That's okay. Love, Jason." I read it 3 times, once with anger, once with grief, and once with nothing but stillness. I didn't cry, not because it didn't move me, but because something in me had already made peace with never hearing those words. It felt like finding a photo you thought had burned years ago, something you can hold now, but don't need anymore. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, not to cherish, not to destroy, just to witness. And I went back to boiling water for tea. That weekend, I cleared out a box of old things, documents, newspaper clippings, a few cracked frames. Among them was a tiny card yellowed at the edges, the words barely visible. "To the bestest mom in the whole wide world." His handwriting. Age 6. I stared at it for a long while. Then I smiled. Not because of the nostalgia, because I knew who I had been. Through it all. From the first scraped knee to the last breath in that ICU bed. I had shown up. I had stayed. I had loved. Even when it wasn't returned. Even when it was signed away. Even when the only voice I had was a single blink in a quiet room. I had loved. And now I had learned something even harder, how to love myself in his absence. The days grew longer, warmer. Spring peeled open slowly outside my window branches, budding green daffodils curling from the dirt with unearned confidence. I sat with the windows open most mornings, letting the breeze carry in the sound of birdsong and distant laughter from the children at the school down the street. It was the kind of peace I hadn't known in decades. Not silence, but peace. There's a difference. Silence can be cruel cold imposed. But peace is earned, even if the earning leaves you with scars. I began to write again. Nothing elaborate. Just sentences, fragments of memory, lists of things I remembered about myself that had nothing to do with motherhood. Favorite book, Rebecca. First concert, Tina Turner. 88 nosebleed seats. Laughed so hard once I peed myself in a movie theater. Secret dream, own a tiny bookshop where no one asks questions. I filled pages. Not diaries, not journals, just pages. Things I had forgotten I was allowed to remember. It was like finding the thread of myself again after years of unraveling for someone else. Some days I walked with a cane. Other days just holding the wall. I passed my own reflection in the hallway mirror often and paused. Not out of vanity, but curiosity. Who was she now, this woman with tired eyes and a steel spine? I didn't have the answer. But I no longer needed one. I got a call from the hospital one afternoon. It was Megan. She sounded brighter than usual. I wanted to tell you something, she said. I got promoted. I'm leading a new patient recovery program, one focused on cases like yours. Full locked-in awareness with incomplete diagnoses. That's wonderful, I rasped. My voice was still soft, grainy like gravel, but it worked. It's because of you, she said. You were the first patient I ever caught blinking. You changed how I see everything. I smiled, felt tears prick my eyes. You saw me, I said. Yeah, she said. And I'll never stop looking now. It struck something deep in me. That idea to be seen. How rare it is. How easy it is to go a lifetime without it. Jason had seen me once years ago, when I was strong and sharp and always in motion. When I fed him, clothed him, carried the weight of his growing. But over time, I became invisible. To him. To his wife. To the world that quietly tells older women they have expired. But Megan had seen me. Without history. Without expectation. Without guilt. And that somehow mattered more than any letter. That weekend, I took a taxi to the park by the lake. I hadn't been there in years, not since Jason was little when he used to collect rocks like treasure and throw them into the water one by one, telling me each one had a secret name. I found a bench in the sun and sat with a thermos of tea. People passed by, young couples, joggers, a little girl dragging a balloon behind her. I sat in that warm silence, not needing anything. Not waiting for anyone. A breeze lifted the edges of my coat, and I let it. And then I did something I hadn't done in nearly a year. I laughed. Not a big laugh. Not even loud. Just a breath of joy that escaped from somewhere inside, small and true. It surprised me. There had been so much grief in the months before. So much stillness. But life was stirring again. Not because someone came back. Not because something was returned. But because I chose to be here. I chose not to fade. On my way back to the taxi, I passed a woman holding her mother's arm, helping her up a slope. Their rhythm was slow, deliberate. I watched them for a moment. Not with envy, but with a kind of ache. A sweet one. And then the mother turned and looked at me. Just for a second. She smiled. I smiled back. We didn't need words. There are some things only women like us understand. I received another letter 2 weeks later, this time from a lawyer. At first, my chest tightened the way it always did when I saw official envelopes, old instincts from a lifetime of bills and obligations. I sat with it on the counter for nearly an hour before opening it. Inside was a formal notice Jason had placed the house proceeds into a trust in my name. Fully accessible. No stipulations. No explanation. I read the letter twice, not out of disbelief, just out of habit. Then I folded it neatly, set it aside, and made myself a bowl of oatmeal. It didn't feel like closure, or justice, or even an apology. It felt like a transaction made too late. But I wasn't angry. Not then. I had passed through anger months ago, like a fever that eventually breaks, leaving you damp and hollow and strangely clear. Money could never return what was taken from me in that room, in those quiet conversations where I was spoken about like an object already gone. No trust fund could restore the years I gave freely, the hundreds of nights I'd sat in the dark beside his bed, praying for his fevers to break, for his nightmares to stop, for his heart to grow whole and strong. But I cashed the check anyway, not because I needed it, but because I deserved it. I used some of it to buy new shoes, black leather with soft insoles and solid support. The kind of shoes meant for walking long distances with no need to hurry. I donated the rest to a community center nearby where women with no family support could find legal help and temporary shelter. That was the first thing I'd done with money that felt like power instead of survival. Jason didn't call again. I think he knew. Some things aren't meant to be rebuilt. Some bridges aren't burned. They just crumble from the weight of what's never said. I still had his letter. I'd read it once more after the trust paperwork arrived. The handwriting was steadier than I remembered, less like a son writing to a mother, more like a man trying to quiet a ghost. I placed it back in the drawer beneath the daisy bookmark and the crayon apology. That night I dreamt I was underwater again, like I had been in the ICU. But this time, there was no fear, just stillness, no voices above me, no paperwork, no betrayal, only light filtering down through the water like music, and breath, my own breath, steady, calm mine. I woke with tears on my pillow, not from grief, not from loss, from peace. The next morning, Lorna knocked on my door with 2 mugs of coffee and a sly smile. "Weather's too good to sit inside," she said. "You walking today?" I nodded, pulling on my sweater. We walked slowly, a rhythm we'd come to know well. 2 women nearly strangers, bound by proximity and some invisible thread of shared resilience. As we turned the corner past the rose bushes, she asked, "You ever think about writing all this down?" I laughed. It would sound like fiction. "Good stories usually do," she said, sipping from her mug. I didn't answer right away. I thought about all the women I'd known in my life, silent women, dismissed women, erased women. I thought about my own mother, about the women I'd cared for at the hospital, about the nurse who brushed my hair even when she thought I wasn't there. Maybe a story wasn't about justice, or even memory. Maybe it was just about being seen. One last time. Later that afternoon, I took out a blank notebook. On the first page I wrote, "I survived in silence. Now I speak." It didn't matter if anyone read it. The writing itself was the resurrection. And as I sat in the light of the window pen moving across paper, I understood something I hadn't been able to name before. I had been paralyzed. I had been betrayed. I had been discarded. But I had not been erased. The apartment grew fuller somehow as the months passed. Not with things, but with moments. Real ones. Morning sun across the tiles. Evening tea with soft jazz playing from a small radio I found at a yard sale. The low murmur of passing lives just beyond my balcony. It became a rhythm I didn't know I needed. I found myself sleeping through the night for the first time in years. Not because I was untroubled, but because my body finally trusted the quiet. The therapist once asked me during a home visit, "Do you feel safe here?" I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know, but because I hadn't realized until she asked that yes, I did. Not just physically, emotionally. No one here expected me to smile. No one here asked me for anything. No one here weighed my value in favors or property or performance. I was just a woman in a small apartment, alive. And that was enough. It was strange sometimes to think back to that hospital bed, to those quiet conversations at my bedside that they thought I couldn't hear. And stranger still to realize I no longer dreamed of revenge. There had been a time, of course, when I wanted him to suffer, when I wanted her to choke on the same helplessness they had handed to me, like a gift wrapped in logic, when I imagined courtrooms and letters and confessions. But now I just wanted peace. Not a truce. Not a handshake. Peace with myself. Some days I still blinked at shadows in the corner of my mind, the what-ifs, the regrets, the grief. But they passed faster now, like weather. I let them. Then I made soup, or opened a new book, or walked to the post office just to feel the air. It was enough. One afternoon, I found myself standing at the mirror again, brushing out my hair. The woman looking back at me had wrinkles, silver roots, slight tremor in her left hand. But her eyes were clear, present. I whispered, "You're still here." And for the first time, it didn't feel like a plea. It felt like a statement, a promise. That weekend, a letter came from Jason. Not a lawyer, not typed, handwritten. It was short. "Mom, I'm moving. We sold the house again. It never felt like ours. I don't know what I'm doing most days, but I wanted to tell you something. I see it now. What you gave, what it cost. I know it's late. I know I missed it when it mattered most, but if you ever want to talk, I'll listen. Not to fix anything, just to hear you. I'm sorry. Love, Jason." I stared at the letter for a long time, not with anger, not even sadness, just a deep bone-level quiet. He had said the right words, but I didn't know if I had any more to say, and that I realized was a form of healing too. Not every wound ends with a reunion, some just close. And scars, though visible, are no longer raw. That night I wrote him back, not to reopen the past, not to rebuild something broken, but to give him what I had finally given myself, a boundary. "Jason, thank you for your letter. I am living in a place that feels like peace, and I'm not interested in re-entering what hurt me. That doesn't mean I haven't forgiven you. I have. But forgiveness isn't permission. It's release. I wish you well. Truly, but from a distance. Mom." I mailed it the next morning. No hesitation, no tears, just breath. The door closed, and the air was still. It's strange how easily people talk about moving on as if it's something you decide on a Tuesday afternoon and execute by Thursday. But grief isn't linear, and healing doesn't obey commands. There were days I woke up gasping, sweat clinging to my skin, the memory of machines and paperwork heavy in my throat. There were nights I dreamt I was blinking furiously, desperate to be seen, only to watch people walk past me. Jason, her nurses with indifferent eyes, never looking down. But those dreams came less frequently now. Instead, I started dreaming of other things, of laughter I hadn't heard in years, of the smell of my mother's cornbread, of riding my bike in the rain when I was 11, no helmet, no fear, just wind and motion, and that impossible sense of freedom. I began writing letters I never sent, not to Jason, to myself, to the version of me that stayed quiet too long, to the girl who thought love meant sacrifice, to the woman who was taught that being strong meant being silent. In one letter I wrote, "You don't owe anyone your disappearance." I taped it to the refrigerator. I passed it every day, and every day I believed it a little more. I said yes to things I never would have before: dinner with neighbors, a knitting group at the library, a watercolor class where I painted flowers that looked nothing like flowers. One afternoon, a woman in class complimented my hands. "They look like they've built things," she said. I looked down at them, nodded, veined familiar, and smiled. "They have," I said. My body was not what it once was. My hands sometimes trembled. My left foot dragged a little when I was tired. But I carried no shame in those things anymore. The betrayal had carved deep, yes, but it hadn't taken everything. It hadn't taken me. One day in late summer, I visited the old neighborhood. Not out of longing, just curiosity. The house was still there, freshly painted, new porch railings, a different car in the driveway. The swing set had been taken down. I stood across the street for a while unnoticed. It looked like any other house now, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not sorrow, just space, as if all the memories I'd once stored there had finally come home with me. I turned and walked away. Not slowly, not dramatically, just walked. Free. I passed a woman and her daughter on the sidewalk. The little girl was skipping, holding a dandelion. She offered it to me as I passed. I took it. "Make a wish," she said. I smiled at her, leaned down slightly. "I already got it." She giggled and ran ahead. I stood for a moment with the dandelion in my hand, its seeds trembling in the breeze. Then I let them go, right there in the middle of a sidewalk that once carried all my hope and pain. And as they scattered into the air, I felt it not closure, not resolution, but flight. The next season came without announcement, just the subtle shift of light, the quiet trade of green for rust, of warmth for crisp wind. Autumn, my favorite, always had been. I decorated the apartment with small, deliberate touches, a woven throw in burnt orange cinnamon sticks simmering on the stove, a tiny ceramic pumpkin from a thrift store shelf. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I just wanted it to feel like mine. One morning, while sorting through a box of old holiday things, I found a cassette tape labeled in my handwriting, "Jason Christmas '94. I held it in my hand for a long time, the plastic warm from the sun through the window. I didn't have a cassette player anymore. But that didn't matter. I could hear it in my mind anyway. His tiny voice still lisping through baby teeth, singing Jingle Bells off key. His laughter, the way he shouted, "I love you, Mama," just before the tape clicked off. My throat tightened. I set the cassette gently in the drawer with the letters and the daisy and the photo. Not everything had to be played again to be remembered. Grief, I learned, doesn't just visit after death. It lingers in the loss of what you thought would last, of who you believed someone would always be. But it doesn't get the final word. That's what I'd come to understand. I wasn't the same woman who once lived for the sound of her son's voice. I wasn't the same woman who measured her worth in usefulness, who accepted crumbs and called them love. I was someone else now, someone quieter, stronger in a way that didn't need to be proven, someone who survived more than one kind of death and came back. There were no grand revelations, no cinematic triumph, just a slow returning, a reclaiming. Each day was an act of choosing to stay, to breathe, to soften, to speak, sometimes to say no, sometimes to say nothing at all. I joined a book club. I started baking again, not out of obligation, but because I liked the smell of nutmeg in the kitchen. I bought a radio and played the oldies station while I folded laundry. I danced in my socks when no one was looking. I didn't check the mail for letters anymore. If Jason ever called again, I didn't know. I'd taken the landline off the hook. The silence I kept now was mine. On the first cold night of November, I sat at the window wrapped in Lorna's old shawl hands, curled around a mug of tea, watching the sky dissolve into dusk. Somewhere in the distance, wind chimes stirred. The glass pane trembled gently, not from a storm, not from impact. Just a gust of air through the trees, enough to make the window shiver. I placed my palm flat against the cool glass and closed my eyes. There was no vengeance left in me, no need for explanation, just this moment, this breath. And the woman I had become inside it. Some things had been lost beyond repair, but others, quiet things, lasting things, had begun to root in their place. I no longer lived for anyone else's understanding. I no longer needed to be heard by the people who once refused to see me. I was still here, still breathing, still holding my own name gently in my mouth like something finally worth saying. It wasn't the ending I'd imagined. It was better, quieter, truer mine. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.